Hello everyone. What happens when literature meets empire, industry, and morality? Welcome to the Victorian Age, a period of dramatic change, innovation, and introspection. This era witnessed the peak of the British Empire, industrial progress, and deep societal reflection, all captured powerfully in its literature. In this lesson, I'll talk about the Victorian period and the time frame of it. We'll see why do we call it Victorian. I'll mention some of the historical events that happened during this period. We'll see the key characteristics and the key themes during the Victorian Age. We'll get to know some of the important authors and their literary works during this period. We'll get to see the language and the literary devices used, and we'll have a look at art and the illustrated novels that we can see during the Victorian period, and we'll talk about its impact and importance as a literary period in English literature. As a recap, at the end of this lesson, I'll compare between Romanticism and the Victorian period. So let's get started. Let's start with the time frame. The Victorian Age spans between circa 1837 till 1901. This period during Queen Victoria, when she ruled Britain almost for 64 years. Now let's get to see why do we call it the Victorian Age. This age is named after Queen Victoria, whose long and influential reign symbolized an age of expansion, moral strictness, and progress. Her image and values became synonymous with the cultural and literary atmosphere of the time. So let's get to know some of the historical events that happened during this age. First, we see the Industrial Revolution, which transformed society, leading to urbanization, new technologies, and new social problems as well. We see the British Empire reaching its peak, as I mentioned in the beginning of this lesson, and we see the spread of the English culture and colonialism across the globe. We see also scientific advancements like Darwin's theory of evolution, which challenged traditional beliefs. We see, of course, class division, one of the main themes in the Victorian Age. We see child labor, uh, poverty, and the role of women in the society. And we see a growing middle class emerged, influencing publishing, reading habits, and values. The Victorian Age itself can be divided into three sub-periods. We can start with the first one. We can call it the early Victorian period between 1837 and 1850. It's considered a time of transition marked by optimism, reform movements, and growing industrialization. Literature in this period often addressed poverty and injustice. We'll see this theme mentioned a lot during the Victorian Age. We have the mid-Victorian period between 1851 and 1870. Of course, these dates are approximate, not the exact dates. It's considered the high point of Victorianism. This period saw confidence in progress, scientific discovery, and imperial expansion, as we mentioned in the beginning. And we see the late Victorian period, approximately between 1871 and 1901. This sub-period is kind of more critical, and sometimes it's considered as a darker phase of the Victorian Age. Let's get to check the key characteristics of the Victorian Age. We see realism, which is a focus on the everyday lives of people, especially the poor and the working class. We see a kind of shift towards the moral purpose, As we see, literature was expected to uphold and explore morality and duty. We see literature in the Victorian age as a social critique tool. So we see authors questioning inequality, industrial abuse, and the role of institutions. And we see also like novels, long novels published in parts, and this became really popular during the Victorian age. And we see also strong narratives and detailed descriptions, which were really dominant in the Victorian literature. So we can say that the key themes that we can see in Victorian literature include realism, social critique, morality, and progress. Now let's move to see the authors and the literary works of the Victorian age. We can start with Charles Dickens, one of the most important figures in Victorian literature. His works embodied the Victorian spirit, let's say. We have Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, Hard Times, and many other literary works that talked about industrialism and child labor and many other uh, Victorian themes. We have the Brontë sisters, like Charlotte and Emily. Don't get confused if you see some of the scholars saying that the Brontë sisters are romantic authors. Actually, their lives overlap two literary periods, the Romantic one and the Victorian one. So they are considered Victorian in some places. In other resources, you might see them described as romantic. So both are correct, I think. We see also some important authors like Thomas Hardy, and we have also George Eliot and many other famous authors. The language of the Victorian literature, we see the use of formal descriptive language with long sentences and complex structures. We see the emphasis on imagery, symbolism, and allegory to reflect moral and social issues. We see also frequent use of dramatic monologues, especially in poetry. And we see, of course, irony, satire, used to talk about the social conditions of people, especially from the middle and the poor classes. We see, of course, topics related to marriage, education, and the role of women in society. Now, let's get to see the art and the culture during the Victorian period. As far as art is concerned in the Victorian age, we see the emerge of a group of artists and poets called the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which emerged during the Victorian age, and they called for visual art and they focused on medievalism, nature, and beauty. And we see art during the Victorian age becoming more concerned with morality, narrative, and emotional depth. So, architecture favored Gothic revival, reflecting nostalgia and national pride. We see also the illustrated novels. I will talk about them in the next slide. In the Victorian age, as I mentioned, we see illustrated novels. They were common and popular in the Victorian age. We see many novels published in serial form in magazines with the illustrations included. This gave the readers a new experience and got them more engaged. For example, we see Charles Dickens' novels Oliver Twist and Bleak House. They were famously illustrated during the Victorian age. And this new style, let's say, appealed to the audience and made literature more accessible. Let's talk about the importance and the impact of the Victorian literature in English literature. So, this literature laid the groundwork for modern realist fiction. It laid the groundwork for the next modernist period, which we'll talk about later. And we have like a kind of moral instruction and social commentary on like religious and societal events. And also Victorian literature is still popular up till now, and many universities and schools still teach pieces of literature from the Victorian age. This is because of the language used in the Victorian literature, as we see like the rich language and the deep meanings. So let's now get to compare Romanticism and the Victorian age as a recap. So let's get started with this. So as usual, let's have a kind of recap. Romanticism and Victorianism. Let's start with focus. We can say that Romanticism focuses on emotion, nature, and individualism. Meanwhile, Victorianism focuses on the society, morality, and realism. And the tone is imaginative and idealistic in Romantic literature. Meanwhile, in Victorian literature, we see practical, moral, and sometimes pessimistic literature. And the setting, we see nature and personal settings in the Romantic literature. Meanwhile, we see urban, industrial, public sphere settings in the Victorian literature. The key figures, as you remember in the previous video, the Romantic period, we talked about William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Lord Byron. For the Victorian age, of course, Charles Dickens and the Brontës sisters. And for the literary style, we have, as you remember, the Romantic period was the age of poetry, and we see lyrical and experimental style of literature. Meanwhile, as I mentioned earlier, the Victorian literature is structured, detailed, heavy, and also full of like great expressions. So, Victorianism emerged partly as a response to Romantic ideals, we can say, shifting the focus from the inner self and the personal into the society and external realities and duties. So here, as you see on the right of the screen, we have Romantic is like subjective and the other one is objective. We have to be careful when we say objective. Objective, at least trying to be objective, let's say. So these are the main differences between Romanticism and Victorianism. We did this just to recap. Now, I think we've finished. So let's call it a day. And in the next video, I'll talk about the modernist period. Hope to see you then. Have a good one.